Welcome to the Telehealth Awareness Week. This week we're introducing the thought leaders in telehealth, particularly those who've worked in TSIM, the Telehealth Service Implementation Model. With me today is Shawn Valenta, who is one of the contributors and chief editors of the publication, TSIM, the Telehealth Service Implementation Model. You've probably seen the book, but we have some very exciting news that we'd like to announce on this webinar today. And we'd love to welcome you, Shawn. Tell us a bit about you.
Yeah, thanks, Orian. My name's Shawn Valenta. I've been in healthcare for over 20 years now. I actually started my career as a respiratory therapist. So I started at the bedside doing a lot of ICU, emergency medicine, had leadership roles in that department. But over the last decade, I've been all in telehealth. So I was the first director of telehealth at the Medical University of South Carolina back in 2013. Held that position until late October of 2020, when I transitioned into a large correctional healthcare company where we're delivering telehealth services to jails and prisons across the country, working on delivering more efficient, cost-effective, higher quality, higher reliable care across the system. And so we've been on a fun journey over the last 10 years.
That's fantastic. And we're really pleased to have the opportunity to work with you. Obviously, your expertise and knowledge in this industry is something that we're really grateful for, and especially coming into this standardization, as it were, of how to approach telehealth and making a practice that works. So what is TSIM? Could you tell us a bit more about it? Telehealth Service Implementation Model. It sounds like a mouthful, but we don't really quite understand what it is, or maybe some of the listeners do today, but it'd be good if we just kind of gave them some idea of what it is.
Yeah, TSIM is a framework that allows teams to take a standard approach from taking an idea about telehealth through a phased approach all the way into a fully successfully scaled service. And so what that means is through the different phases of strategy, development, implementation, operations, the teams are addressing key things that if they don't address them, they're opening themselves up for failure down the road. And so what TSIM is really a framework that pulls together all the best practices of telehealth, not only in MUSC's experience that goes back to 2005, but even decades before that, of all the things that have been learned of the implementation challenges that, hey, if you do these things of best practice, you're able to mitigate some of those challenges and really position your organization to be successful with all the technology they've already invested in.
You mentioned something really interesting there. You speak about investment. So one of the things that we've been using in the messaging around TSIM is defending the investment that you've made in your telehealth strategy so far by taking some of this best practice that has been learned from the MUSC and is now extending it into other organizations. How are you finding that now that you're no longer with MUSC and you're into other roles? Are you finding that TSIM is still proving valuable?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of, I think, the exciting things for me to go into a different organization and say, can I replicate the success that we had at MUSC with a different organization, different teams, different resources and everything? And everything I've used since coming has been the TSIM framework in regards to, all right, we have an idea, we want to develop this type of service. We put it through a strategy phase at first. We made sure we answered all the key questions. We made sure we had a clinical champion, defined what problem we were solving. What was that basic clinical workflow? What will be our metrics to measure our success throughout this? And then even going through every phased approach of development, working with legal and regulatory, building those outcome dashboards, documenting the clinical workflow, the emergency protocols, getting the technology right with access and everything else. And thankfully, I've been able to replicate the success. We've scaled multiple services across the nation just in the last couple of years that I've been with my new company.
You've mentioned a lot of potential complications, difficulties and challenges that you have to overcome as you're going from an idea to a service that's being delivered. And all those milestones or landmines, however you want to view them, have to be traversed. It almost feels to me like you're studying a map and trying to go from one place to another. But so you speak about doing it at scale. What are some of the other bigger challenges in the marketplace when you start hitting scale? Because small implementations, people might know it really well, but as people try to take that service into a bigger community, what are some of the bigger challenges that people may face?
Yeah, you get into, I would say, two big things, especially when you're in a full operation standpoint. It's around your operational technology. I mean, when you're at scale, there's not a lot of grace period from you're out of this pilot phase, right? So there's not a lot of grace period of, well, the technology did this. So there's a lot of things you have to do from a technical standpoint of making sure your technical infrastructure is strong, the network you're delivering, the software, doing all that maintenance up front to make sure that you're mitigating as many incidents as you possibly can. But knowing that you're still dealing with technology, you're still going to have incidents. So having a full-fledged team, 24-hour support to be able to respond immediately to those incidents, know how to respond, know how to escalate, know how to activate emergency downtime procedures or backups, and then a process of problem management of understanding, okay, how did this incident occur? How can we prevent this from happening again in the future? So there's a big thing from the technology standpoint. And then from an operational standpoint, a lot of organizations unfortunately have looked at, we went live with this service, like job, mission accomplished. And then a year later, they're finding out, like, why is the utilization of our service not what we thought it was going to be? So there's so much work that happens in the operations phase of, all the different stakeholders involved. How is this service impacting your patients, your providers, the payers, your different partners, all those different components? How are you using the success metrics that you identified in the strategy phase? How are you measuring them in operations? And then using that to continuous quality improvement. I always look at, once a service goes live, now you've kind of got a baseline of what you're doing. And then you get into a lot of service optimizations and CQI. Too often, I think people look at telehealth almost like it's a drug. Like, when we went live, we tried it for 6 months, it didn't work. When really telehealth is a process improvement, quality improvement initiative. It allows you to intersect into something that was occurring with a new tool. It opens up maybe some level of access or expertise that wasn't there before. But that's typically not enough. Like, you have to then use that entrance into this workflow and then figure out, how do you optimize this expertise? How do you optimize this access that you've opened up? And so some of that's lost, but we try to cover a lot of that in TSIM to make sure. And you're right, it is like a map. And the way I look at TSIM is not a map of saying you have to take this road and you have to follow this specific road. It's a map of saying, here are big barriers. Here are checkpoints that you need to navigate. There's a bunch of roads you can go through. And I think, and when you're dealing with something that's so innovative, you can't have, well, I have to go to step 1, I have to go to step 2, I have to go to step 3. Then that kind of crushes some of the creativity. But you also can't have like an open field of, like, we'll just run where we want to run, right? So there has to be some guidance, some parameters, and that's why I've loved about TSIM is it's given some framework for innovators to be able to run quickly to getting services to successful scale.
Yes, I remember when we were working through the publication of the book, you were deep in the trenches at that point with the response to COVID. So yes, you're right. There are significant things that you have to go through, but there is a common level of approach. There's steps that you have to take, and regardless of the road you're going to go on, you have to kind of think through those things. The potential obstacles if you go down this route, potential obstacles if you go down the other route. So I think that's going to be quite interesting to see how people will then, like you said, know how to take those decisions when they reach those crossroads, and how to behave as a team that's well drilled so that everyone knows what to do. The changing the tire while the vehicle is in motion. The services have to be maintained and have to continue to deliver value because you're dealing with people's lives.
Yeah, and I would say this too. because I've heard someone ask me once, this was a couple of years ago, well, how can you have this standardized approach when telehealth services are so different? They're like, how can you say that developing maybe a telehealth service that's going to work in the hospital, you can't have the same approach if you're creating a remote patient monitoring program out in the field for a diabetic. And which I love the question because it allowed me to respond. It's like, for both of those things, do you not have to have a clinical strategy of what you're trying to achieve? Well, yes. For both of those things, do you not have to have a clinical champion? Yes. For both of those things, do you have to have success metrics? Yes. For both of those things, do you have to have a clinical workflow? Yeah. Like, so they start realizing, like, oh, okay, now I understand what you're saying. And that kind of, I think, opened up some people's minds of, it's not something that's like stringent. It's something, again, parameters to make sure that people are successful. And it's a lot of stuff that if you've been developing and implementing telehealth services for 10, 15, 20 years, you get like, oh, wow, yeah, you guys just put together best practices, which hasn't been done before in this form, to really help telehealth leaders and the teams that they manage.
So best practice comes from a community of practice. So we understand that this publication has now been extrapolated into delivery of a course, which is the exciting news we're announcing this week. So the telehealth service implementation model is now able to move beyond just a guidebook into a best practice that can be taught and shared with others. What we are going to be doing over the next couple of weeks, so this is the first of a few interviews that we will be having that will take us through the different people in the community that have started to apply TSIM within their workplace and are starting to reap the benefits. Some of them have only just done the course as part of the first pilot group, and we'd love to hear their feedback. So we've discussed some of the ways TSIM makes a difference. Shawn, give us some tips. If you were to take the course, what would you say to someone who was taking the course, rather? Because I know you have taken the course.
I have taken the course. If someone who's tips for someone who's going to take the course,
Yes.
I mean, one, I would just encourage people to do it. I mean, if you're leading telehealth teams, or you've been selected as your organization for a clinical transformation in this initiatives, whether that's telehealth or digital health, or you're just interested in that, I'd strongly encourage people to take the course. To me, the course gives you the validation of, I have the foundational knowledge. I prepared myself to protect the investments of my organization. I prepared myself to be able to provide a systematic approach to ensure that my team isn't frustrated, our providers aren't frustrated as we develop services. So the one thing is, I would just strongly encourage people to take the course. And I think we've made it pretty fun. I mean, the course, of course, is based off the guidebook. So that's the main source of truth throughout it all. But we've been able to include all kinds of things like different audio podcasts with different thought leaders, clinical champions, administrative leaders, people that are experts in legal and cybersecurity. We've got different fun videos that intersect throughout, knowledge checks and different questions. So the feedback that I've gotten so far from those who've taken it has been extremely positive. And it is encouraging then when you hear from those folks who have become TSIM certified that say, hey, I just took this full plan in to our C-suite leaders of this new telehealth service, and the whole thing was packaged in the TSIM framework. And for them to be able to sell the services that way, it's they felt good about it because it gave them a full, like, hey, I knew that I had every I dotted, every T crossed, and I had a full-fledged plan, and it was well received.
Well, you certainly make TSIM sound like an elixir for anybody who's struggling with certain aspects of their telehealth service implementation in their organization. We look forward to seeing the impact that this framework will have as more people start to use it. It will certainly make a massive difference for the ultimate customer, which is the end user. So we always have to remain focused on the value that all the work that we're doing in all our roles feeds into this bigger picture.